Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Throwing you all a curve, I'm not speaking from the front of the room tonight. Hello, and thank you for everybody for coming out to our historical presentation night here at the Yankee Air Museum. We're very excited to have with us our very own historian, Randy Horton. Just for a sign of hands, show just a sign of hands. How many members do we have here tonight? Very good, very good. How many non-members? How many of Randy's family? Friends, yeah, friends and family of Randy. Yeah, that's good. That's good. We're real excited to have him here. Randy served in the U.S. Navy as a pilot of a P-3 Orion, where he reached the rank of captain, in addition to serving as a Yankee Air Museum board member and lecturer. Captain Horton is a professional pilot with USA Jet Airlines and pilots the museum's B-17 bomber and C-47 DC-3 during our flying season, and has recently been elected to the Michigan Aviation Hall of Fame. So I think he's soon to be inducted.
And getting a Wright Brothers Award.
And getting the Wright Brothers Award. Here, that will be presented later in May here at the museum.
And drinks will be served.
But tonight he'll be providing us with an inside look at the Revolt of the Admirals, a feud that erupted when Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson ordered to cut defense spending in 1949, affecting the national aviation. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Randy Horton.
Good to be here tonight. As far as the Michigan Hall of Fame went, I got a phone call about 4 weeks ago, and the guy told me that I'd been elected to the Michigan Aviation Hall of Fame and I'd be inducted on April 18th of this year. And I said, Ron, that's not funny. I don't even know what you're talking about. He says, no, this is Billy Bob from whatever, and you've been elected, and you'll get the credentials and stuff in the mail. So this is, I am truly humbled by it. I don't know how I got it, but I am honored to be recognized for that. How many Navy people do we have in the room here? I know we got some of them. Look, got a lot of hands there. Okay. This is a fascinating topic that I ran across, and I did some research on it. The Revolt of the Admirals. And after World War II, the U.S. Navy was the mightiest Navy the world had ever seen. And you look at the figures there, 151 aircraft carriers, 113 VP patrol squadrons, 41,000 airplanes, 4 million sailors. The world had never seen something like this. This fleet operated indefinitely off the coast of Japan until the end of the war. But the demobilization plans that had been set up by the government to orderly bring the fleet in and downsize it and preserve the ships was put aside by the tremendous demand of the American public. Bring the boys home now. So ships were almost just parked at the pier, and the sailors walked off them, and almost new ships. The U.S. Marine Corps is cut from 5 divisions to 2 divisions. They're only equipped with 2 regimental combat teams. Amphibious fleet is cut by 90%. The military is downsized. The atomic bomb has changed how wars will be fought. The U.S. Air Force delivered the first 2 atomic bombs. They were called the Army Air Force at that time, and they felt that they had a monopoly on the atomic bomb. And if anybody in the U.S. military had atomic bombs, it had to be the Army Air Force. The U.S. Army Air Force wanted all land-based airplanes to be Air Force airplanes. No other service could have land-based airplanes. They would dominate the skies. And this was a way to save money. You'd get rid of one service's aviation and save some money, so it was supported by the Truman administration. They started the Defense Unification Act right after World War II. And the Army and the Air Force wanted a German-style general staff where a majority ruled. And the Navy didn't want this because the Army and the Air Force were joined at the hip, and they'd always go together as a team, and they didn't want to have the Navy's views overlooked. They wanted one Secretary of Defense who would be the commander of this joint staff. But there'd be three branches. There'd be the Air, the U.S. Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. And the Marines would be transferred to the Army because you don't need amphibious forces anymore. We'd never invade another country. But the Navy wanted independent services that could direct their own futures with their own independent secretaries. And the Marine Corps was not highly thought of by the Army and the Air Force. They thought they were the glory boys who stole all the pictures of the flag in Iwo Jima, etc. So, Chief of Staff of the Army, George Marshall, right up here in this corner, says, I'm going to make sure I never see the Marines win another war. So they come together, and the U.S. Army Air Force becomes the U.S. Air Force, an independent service, just like the Army and the Navy. And the Army Air Force and U.S. Air Force mounts this tremendous PR campaign. They were PR masters against the Navy. And the Navy was the opposite end of that scale. We're very private. We're out at sea where nobody can see us. We don't have to tell anybody what we're doing. It's dragging on. So Truman orders the Chief of Staff, solve this problem. I want this Defense Unification Act done now. And the Secretary of the Navy is a man named Forrestal. And he's got a friend, a Wall Street financier. These Wall Street financiers show up all the time in the federal government. And he comes up with a solution that there'd be three separate service branches, Army, Air Force, and Navy, in a Secretary of Defense in a Defense Department where they'd still be independent, but they'd be a joint Defense Department. So the National Security Act of 1947 is passed. They established the CIA and National Security Agency. The Navy would retain carrier-based tactical aviation, which is what they wanted. They'd maintain land-based patrol and transport squadrons. The Marines would remain part of the Navy. And the Marines would be allowed to retain their aviation assets. This goes into effect October 17th, 1947. Truman wants to cut the budget. He wants money for domestic programs, schools, roads, hospitals. The budget was $45 billion. You can hardly buy an aircraft carrier for that nowadays, but that was 1947. He wanted to cut it by 60% to $14 billion in 48 and have it down to 3% of GNP by 1951. And the unification would have to go further to gain these savings. And he, again, also hated the Marines because of his experience in World War I, and they got all the glory for Bellewood while he was slogging away other places in Europe. So he wanted to get rid of the Marine Corps also. Chester Nimitz had been CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, up until the Unification Act. And Louis Denfield, he's a surface officer, sink pack, well-liked, capable officer. He becomes CNO in December 1947. The Navy decides if I've got a surface warfare, submarine warfare Chief of Naval Operations, the Assistant Chief of Naval Operations will be an aviator. Likewise, if CNO is an aviator, they'll have a surface submarine assistant, CNO. So they draft a guy named Arthur Rafford, who was a carrier group commander from the Pacific, very, very savvy, a good politician, a crack tactician with airplanes, and they worked together real well on providing what the Navy would need for the future. Remember, the Unification Act was passed in October of 47. The Winter White House is where Harry Truman spent the winters down in Key West. Anybody ever been down there seen the Winter White House? It's a museum piece down there. And they have a meeting down there, and they come up that they're going to reconfirm the Navy gets to maintain carriers and tactical naval aviation. They'll have to build a new class of supercarriers in order to accommodate the bigger jets that are now being built. The Air Force would have strategic control of all strategic air assets, as well as all tactical and the logistics functions. The Army could maintain airplanes if they didn't fly higher than a sparrow. So the first of the supercarriers is approved in July of 1947. It's laid down in April of 1949. It's got 4 catapults, 100,000 tons, 4 deck edge elevators. It can operate airplanes up to 70,000 pounds. And they designed 2 airplanes to go on this to deliver nuclear weapons up to 1,200 miles. The A3 Sky Raider. Anybody in the A3 Sky Raider been in here? Okay, there's one guy right there. Okay, 2 guys? Okay. This was an airplane designed in 1947. They flew it to what, about 1990? Yeah. And also this propeller-driven airplane called the Savage. And the Marine Corps operated the Savage into Vietnam. The Secretary of Defense became Forrestal. He was a former Secretary of the Navy. He understood the Navy's carrier needs. He's a strong friend of the Navy. In fact, aircraft carrier CV-59 was named after him, the Forrestal. He puts 5 supercarriers into the 1949 budget. He cancels the building of 17 capital ships, aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, battle cruisers that are up to 80% complete. He canceled building those to get funds for the aircraft carriers. The U.S. Air Force goes nuts because now the Navy wants to spend more money than the Air Force has, and the Air Force is the glory boys, and they should have that money. The Navy wants the aircraft carriers to have nuclear weapons delivery capability. The Air Force stomps its foot and says, no, we agreed that we would be the owners of the nukes. So the unification is not going as well as it's supposed to. And the Secretary of the Navy, Sullivan, and the CNO, Denfield, saw that they would probably have to set up a shop similar to what the Air Force has to fight the Air Force to maintain the Navy as they wanted it. And they picked this guy, Arleigh Burke. And Arleigh Burke is probably one of the classic leaders in the Navy. He'd been the leader of a destroyer group in the Pacific called the Little Beavers. They were renowned for their tactics. He became he went on to Mark Michener's staff as an aircraft carrier staff member, so he understood aviation. And they set up a shop called Op 23. And he's a squared away guy, and he says, I have to know what everybody in the Navy's thinking. I have to hear from people in the Navy on what's going on. There'll be no backroom secret operations. We're going to be transparent. And it will be ethical to the nth degree. And that was what made him an outstanding man. That was his mode of operation. Truman is mad at Forrestal. He fires Forrestal because Forrestal is not cutting the budget. Forrestal kills himself in May of 1949. He jumps out of like the 14th story at Bethesda Naval Hospital. So Truman appoints a new Secretary of Defense, and he gets the job because he helped Truman in his 1948 campaign raising money. His name is Lewis Johnson. Johnson is a relentless conniver, self-serving, with an inflated sense of who he is. He operates independently, he hides behind things, and he loves the Air Force. He is a guy that brought the B-17 into the Air Force before World War II. He's a strong supporter of the Air Force, and he doesn't understand why the Navy thinks they need airplanes. He is named as the worst Secretary of Defense in U.S. history. And you're going to see what happens when he came into office that brought about the revolt of the Admirals. He has not been in office 3 weeks, and he cuts the defense budget and says the Key West Winter White House meetings have no standings with him. He's going to operate to cut the budget. He says he'll work with the current Secretary of the Navy, Sullivan, but while Sullivan's down in Corpus Christi at a speaking event, Johnson cancels the building of the first super aircraft carrier without checking with anybody. He just cancels it. Sullivan is outraged and resigns. Undersecretary of the Navy also resigns. Also a bunch of high-ranking flag officers. The Navy is almost rudderless for leadership now. So Truman appoints a Secretary of the Navy. He's a Catholic. He wants a Catholic in his administration. That is one of his main reasons for being chosen. Plus, he helped with the 1948 presidential campaign. His claim to fame is he's an attorney who was the head of the USO. He's never been in the military. He's never been in a political office. And on his inauguration, he says, the only time I've been near the water was on a rowboat going across a lake. He gets the nickname Rowboat Matthews. Was it something I said? Hello. Maybe I stepped on the cord and unplugged it. Hello? Oh, other part. Hello? Okay. Okay, he's an attorney, and he figures his job as SecNav is going to be a hobby. He's in lockstep with Johnson on budget cuts and unification of the military. So Johnson sees the Navy as a defensive force, not an offensive force. So on May 17th, he's been in office 6 weeks, he says he's going to transfer the U.S. Marine Corps to the Air Force. He's going to cut the Marines down to 12,000 Marines who will be basically embassy guards and guys on ships to make sure the sailors aren't drinking. Going to get rid of the 2 remaining fighter wings. They transfer Arthur Rafford to the Pacific and make him commander of the Pacific, which is a great job and something you wouldn't turn down, but it gets rid of another block of leadership in Washington when they take this guy out of Washington. A replacement for Rafford is another aviator, Dale Price. He's an aviator. He's a great officer. You don't make 3-star, 4-star rank without having something going for you. But he's not a leader, aggressive, future-thinking guy. He's just kind of a guy filling a box and moving along. The Navy is rapidly becoming a rudderless ship. The Air Force, with their PR, touts the B-36 bomber. The B-36 bomber can deliver A-bombs anywhere in the world, which makes naval aviation completely irrelevant. In March of 1949, they demonstrate a nonstop round-the-world flight in the B-36, refueling from KB-50s. They reinforce that conventional forces are obsolete and expensive, and that possession of nuclear weapons and the ability to deliver them will prevent any future wars. Secretary Johnson says that sounds a very cost-effective way. Since we canceled that aircraft carrier, I've got the money from the 17 ships that the Navy canceled. I'll give it to the Air Force so they can build more B-36 bombers. Johnson makes a statement. There's no reason for having the Navy or Marine Corps. General Bradley, chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, tells me that amphibious operations are a thing of the past. We'll never have another amphibious landing again, and that does away with the Marine Corps. And the Air Force can do anything the Navy does, so that does away with the Navy. How would you like this for your boss? The Navy starts to take an aggressive stance on this, and Rear Admiral Gallery. If you ever visited the 505 over at the museum in Chicago where they captured the World War II German sub, he was the commander of the carrier group that caught that. He was a 2-star admiral. He was selected for 3-star admiral. He starts writing a series of articles for Saturday Evening Post, and he captures the last one. Don't let them scuttle the Navy. Secretary of Defense Johnson goes ballistic. Who is this guy? He can't do that. And he wants him court-martialed. Johnson immediately mothballs 3 aircraft carriers on about a 4-week notice. And by the end of June, the Princeton, the Antietam, and the Boxer are up at Bremerton being decommissioned. He takes 1/3 of the active patrol squadrons and sends them to the reserves with their pilots who he kicks out, so they'll have pilots in the reserves. He's going to limit the Navy to 8 aircraft carriers in 1950, and he wants the Navy down to 4 aircraft carriers by 1951. No more deployments overseas. Carriers will strictly be for anti-submarine warfare exercises. All tactical missions will go to the Air Force. The Marine Corps will become part of the Air Force. The Marine Corps will be dissolved and joined with the Army. His first 60 days in office have been like a bull in a china shop. Somebody has to do something. We're having a little J.O. revolt down there in the wardroom. This guy right here, Commander Tom Davies, he flew the truculent turtle. Who knows what the truculent turtle is? Okay, there you go. A P-2V, he flew it nonstop from Perth, Australia to Columbus, Ohio. He was going to go to Washington, D.C., but the weather was bad and they were almost out of gas. 11,000 miles, 55 hours in the air. And he said it's time for a J.O. to step up and stir the pot. And he's working with a guy named Cedric Worth. Now, Worth is a former Hollywood scriptwriter, so he's very adept at making up stories. And so they draft this thing called the anonymous document. And the intent was, and 2 books I read, Tom Davies was standing with 1 foot on a windowsill, his chin on his knee, or his elbow on his knee, his chin, and he said, how do we get a congressional hearing? Because Congress had not been involved in any of Johnson's cuts. So they write this document that's completely fabricated and detrimental to Secretary of Defense Johnson and the B-36. 9 pages, 55 sections, and they say the B-36 is a $1 billion blunder. They say that Secretary of Defense Johnson has a conflict of interest because he's on the board of directors of Convair and made them buy the B-36. Glenn Martin is a big supporter of the Navy. He built the Martin bombers, the Martin seaplanes. He gets a copy of this, which he leaks to Congress. And he introduces it into the congressional hearings. It's now an official record. Johnson, again, he sees this as a challenge to his stature as chairman. Let me get that. I'm reading north here. Carl Vinson, head of the Armed Forces Committee of the Congress, sees Johnson's actions as insubordinate. This has to go through Congress. So he learns of this in June, and he orders a cease and desist. No more cuts, no more nothing until we have hearings. There'll be no more budget cuts, transfers, etc. And Congress calls for a hearing on the B-36 bomber. And they want to look at this anonymous document. So from August 9th to August 15th, Carl Vinson, they hold hearings on unification and strategy, and they find out that the anonymous document was written by Cedric Worth, and it's fabricated. So it becomes known as the worthless document. And Worth gets fired after a court of inquiry. And the rumors circulate that that's the end of it. There'll be no more meetings. But the naval aviators have not had their moment on stage. They want to discuss the cancellation of the United States and the role of naval aviation and the future of the Marine Corps. This inactivity draws Rafford. He's watching from the Pacific, and he knows what's going on in Washington. So he comes back to Washington, and they identify, we have to present the aviators' view to Congress. The U.S. Air Force and others in Congress have the Navy on the ropes. The surface Navy is not participating because they're a little irritated. Before World War II, aviators made up about 5% of the officer ranks, and at the end of World War II, they made up 42% of the officer ranks. Naval aviators were being promoted to admiral in their 30s, where a surface officer might have to wait till his 40s or 50s to be promoted to admiral. Naval aviation by 1951 will be almost completely gone. Rafford is not scheduled to speak, but Burke tells Rafford, Arleigh Burke, head of Op 33, they are not prepared to go to Congress, and we have to get together and put together a good story on why naval aviation needs to be saved. And Rafford agrees. Let's get ready, see what happens. Captain John Cromlin, decorated World War II combat pilot. He's on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's on the promotion list to Rear Admiral. He blasts the Army and the Air Force General Staff concept in a public letter. Matthews, Secretary of the Navy, is outraged because this guy did not go through the chain of command and he didn't get permission to write this letter. Vinson still holds off, Carl Vinson, on having further hearings. So Vice Admiral Bogan, World War II Navy pilot, carrier group commander, writes a classified memo to be circulated commenting on the Cromlin letter about naval aviation. C&O Denfield endorses the memo saying he agrees with what Cromlin said. Matthews, again, is incensed that these little military puppets have a mind of their own and are not following his orders. Again, the House Armed Services Committee sees no need for hearings. Vinson holds off on having more hearings, so the Navy aviators keep the pressure up. This is a copy of the letter that Bogan wrote in comment on Cromlin. Said, the morale of the Navy is lower today than I've ever seen it since I entered my commission ranks in 1916. In my opinion, this descent almost to despondency stems from complete confusion as to the future of the Navy and its advantages and disadvantages as a permanent career. By early September, these rumors are circulating that the committee will not resume it. So Cromlin, holds a press conference and releases the Bogan memo, which is confidential to the press. Again, Matthews said, "You're not listening." He goes nuts and he issues a shut up memo. Rowboat Matthews says, "Follow my orders. I will not stand for this insubordination." He lays down the law. No testimony without my prior approval. So if I see an old Price, who's kind of a quiet guy in the corner, leaks the shut up memo from Rowboat Matthews to the Washington Post, and it's on the front page. Matthews is now livid. Nobody is listening to me. I ran the USO. Don't they listen to me? Okay, Matthews says, "This is coming out of Arleigh Burke's shop. I'm going to raid Op 23 and find out who's running this." Well, there was a spy in the CNO office, and they called over to Op 23, Arleigh Burke, and said, "The Inspector General is coming to your office. He'll be there in 15 minutes. Burke grabs every paper he has and gives it to an aide, and the aide is running around the Pentagon, and if you do that, nobody can find you. So he goes to another office and saves the papers. And they keep Burke and his staff under a CIA POW type of interrogation all night, trying to get them to rat on their fellow officers about what's going on inside this committee. But they finally release him. So the next morning, Burke hops on an airplane and flies to San Francisco to meet Rafford, who's coming back from the Pacific, and they work out what they're going to tell Congress on their way back to Washington. Vinson finally decides we're going to have some more hearings, and they'll be held 6 to 19 October. Vinson wants Rafford and other pro-naval aviation supporters to testify. Matthews is upset that Rafford's coming because he didn't want sharp guys like Rafford testifying. He wanted some disgruntled surface warfare officers who didn't know an airplane from a doorknob. And Matthews makes a very magnanimous saying. He announces that no Navy man would be punished or censored for what they said at the hearings. He expects the officers will follow his orders and not say anything detrimental. And he comes on, "I'm an attorney, and before we go in court, we go over what you're going to say, you're briefed on what you're going to say, so we can present a united front." He does that with Denfield and thinks Denfield will spit out the words that he wants. Matthews starts the hearings out by saying the Bogan memo, which is the morale is bad in the Navy, is false because the Navy has good morale and everybody is happy. Rafford makes a very impressive message. And he says we need both Naval Tactical Air, Marine Corps Tactical Air, and U.S. Air Force. And the B-36 is draining resources from this conventional capability. We have to maintain a conventional capability. And he says all-out nuclear war is inflexible, ineffective, and immoral. And then a collection of famous who's who, Nimitz, Halsey, Spruance, get up and make their pitches on how naval aviation brought the war against Japan to a quick end. And at the end, he states that fleets exist to defeat opposing navies in order to gain control of the sea to pursue national power against the enemy. That's why we have a navy. Burke goes back to the basics in his testimony. He said the U.S. is surrounded by oceans. Therefore, we are a maritime nation. In order for the U.S. to survive, they must be able to command the seas. He makes a statement. The B-36 bomber is vulnerable to the new Navy F-2H Banshee fighter that can climb to 45,000 feet in 10 minutes. With 4 20-millimeter cannon, could take down the B-36. The Air Force says there'll be no tests against this because it's classified and nobody could know about it. Denfield gets up, and Matthews thinks, this is Revolt Matthews, Secretary of the Navy, thinks that he's got Denfield all set on what he's going to say. Denfield sides with the aviators and charges unification is not being intended as found in the National Security Act of 1947. He supports Rafford and Burke that the Navy has a role that's not being defined by the budget. And he states fleets exist to defeat opposing navies in order to gain control of the sea so national power can be extended against the enemy. This shocks Matthews. He accuses Denfield of insubordination, and Johnson wants Denfield fired on the spot. Further testimony comes in before the Armed Services Committee. The Navy is suffering from this Air Force PR machine. The Air Force says the B-36 is a deterrent to war. It flies too high. It flies too fast. It has a precision bombing capability. But they don't add it's obsolete and could never penetrate the Russian airspace. The U.S. Air Force has abandoned tactical air support. They said there's no need for it because we'll never fight another conventional war. The focus is on strategic bombing. All funding is going to the Strategic Air Command. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Vandenberg, states naval air has no strategic capability against any enemy, and it has no use in our national security. And he says the only role the Navy had will be anti-submarine warfare and seaborne transportation of material. He says the Air Force should take over the aircraft carriers like the British RAF. And if you know anything about British RAF history, their airplanes were completely obsolete at the start of World War II. They bring up an Army witness, and they ask him, if you're in frontline combat and you needed close air support, which branch of the service would you like to provide that close air support? And he says, the United States Marine Corps, they are the best. Commandant of the Marine Corps, Gates, testifies that the U.S. Marine Corps air-ground team is an unbeatable combination and the best in the world. Army Chief of Staff, Joint Chief of Staff Chairman, says the Marines are a bunch of fancy dance and states any future war there's no need for amphibious operations, and he hates the Marines just like Truman. Gates says hogwash. He further testifies that strategic bombing is our priority, and he fully supports the cutting of funds for the Navy and the Marine Corps. He doesn't hide his contempt for the ambush methods and accuses Navy officers of poor leadership, disloyalty. Public opinion is shifting against the Navy. They seem like a bunch of out-of-control wackos that are disrupting this thing, and they all favor the Air Force because of the PR of the Air Force. They're the darling of the Defense Department. Senator Clarence Cannon from Missouri makes a statement. He says, we don't need the aircraft carrier. And he says, if a war starts, we must hit within 1 week after the start of the war, and that can only be done with land-based airplanes such as we now have. In spite of the pledge, no one will be punished, Matthews fires Denfield. And he brings in Forrest Sherman, another sharp officer who escaped Washington in 47, and he went to the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. So he's been away from the Washington political scene. He comes in as an unknown outsider, and he's smart enough to stay out of the swamp where all the turmoil is. Vice Admiral Blandy, who testified, is demoted to Rear Admiral, so he quits. Bogan chooses to retire instead of having his rank busted. But 1 week before he resigns, they bust him anyway. Captain Cromlin is furloughed on half pay. Gallery is passed over for Vice Admiral, leaves the Navy. Burke has his name erased from the Rear Admiral promotion list, but he's only rescued by President Truman when Truman says, Burke, wasn't he Mitzner's chief of staff? And Sherman says, yes, he was. And Truman says, well, Mitzner's a pretty sharp guy, and if he liked Burke, I like Burke, put him back on the list. Sherman is the youngest CNO in history. He's a far more effective leader than Denfield. He saves the career of Arleigh Burke. He reduces mothballing. He pushes development of the A.J. Savage and the A-3 Sky Warrior. And he developed plans for rapid recommissioning of these mothballed ships should they be needed. He gets $350 million for future development. He starts the program to build nuclear submarines, and he dies of a heart attack in August of '51. But he leaves his mark on the Navy. Joe Stalin. He didn't testify. But we are an open society. What goes on in our society is published in the press. It's read around the world by all of our enemies. And he's watching the downsize in the U.S. military, and he feels the U.S. will not intervene in a conflict in Asia. In fact, Secretary of State Axon makes a speech. He says, Formosa and South Korea are outside of our area of interest, and we will not defend them. North Korea's Kim Il-sung has been set up as a Soviet state. He considers the South Korean government an illegitimate U.S. puppet government that does not belong in Korea. He convinces Stalin that Korea should be a single country unified under him by force. Stalin misjudges the Truman administration and elects to become involved in Korea. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the Armed Services Committee looks at this and they disapprove of Johnson's downsizing of the Navy. And they fault Johnson for not going to Congress. And they said there was such a thing as too much unification and too fast. And they said this reluctant Navy with an over-ardent Army left little room for any compromise. So in January of '50, Kim goes to Moscow to see Stalin. He presents Stalin with the plan to invade South Korea. Mao Zedong, who's just turned communist China into a country, is up there. He wants to sign the Sino-Soviet Pact. So Stalin, who likes to have other people take the fall, says, why don't you talk to Mao? Mao agrees the weak is south and be conquered easily. Mao Zedong has plans to take over all of Asia to include Korea, Indochina, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, right over to the Pakistan border. He wants that all to be an extension of Red China. He's massing his forces opposite Formosa and is planning to cross the narrow waters there and take Formosa from Chiang Kai-shek. South Korea has 4 combat-tested divisions that fought with Mao in the China Civil War. So Stalin consents to support North Korea invasion of the South. And he says, if the invasion is successful, I will step up with support. Doug MacArthur's over there in Japan. He's in charge of the Pacific area. His staff and the CIA start picking up troop movements in North Korea towards the border. Arms are coming from Russia to the north border of Korea. And MacArthur says, I think they'll attack in June when the weather gets better. So he says, I would like some amphibious ships to come over to Japan to train the Army troops on amphibious operations. At this time, there are 5 amphibious ships left in the Navy. No other ships are available, so this Rear Admiral Doyle, who ran amphibious operations in World War II in the Pacific, takes his ships over there to train the Army. Vincent's final report on unification and strategy is solidly pro-naval aviation. He says United States air power consists of the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy, and the Marine Corps. Strategic bombing is only one aspect, and there is a need for land and sea-based tactical aviation. Public support starts to grow for the Navy. CVN 70. The Vinson is named after Carl Vinson because of his saving of naval aviation. Sherman's absent from Washington allows him a lot of freedom that others wouldn't have. Congress wants to build super carriers, but Sherman says, no, Johnson is still Secretary of Defense. He doesn't want him. I'm not going to cross him. But he pushes for tactical proficiency. The Navy is getting 2 new airplanes, the F-9F Panther jet fighter and the A-1 Sky Raider attack bomber. So he takes the Valley Forge CV-45 and has them go down to Camp Pendleton and practice close air support with the Marine Corps. They become tactically proficient in close air support. They are scheduled to deploy to the Western Pacific in June of 1950. June 25th, 1950, Kim Il-sung's army, with the backing of the Soviet, crossed the 38th parallel. Truman, fearing another Munich like World War II, elects he will defend South Korea. On June 26, the aircraft carrier Valley Forge is in Hong Kong on liberty, is ordered to steam at max speed to Subic Bay in the Philippines and load weapons and fuel. Every ship in the Pacific is ordered to Westpac. 8 ships, 1 cruiser, 7 destroyers, and 1 aircraft carrier. CNO Sherman starts his mobilization plans to get ships out of mothballs. Truman asks the Navy to set up a blockade around North Korea. He's shocked to find the Navy doesn't have any ships. So he asks VP squadrons to cover the shortage. And he finds out he's short of VP squadrons because they commissioned all of them, or decommissioned. So they get VP6 coming out of Hawaii that goes over there and starts flying patrols. And they're flying the P5M, the PV4Y, and the P2V. And they activate 7 reserve squadrons to pick up the load in the Pacific. The Valley Forge departs Subic Bay 28 June 1950, sailing to Korea at high speed. It joins with the Navy, Royal Navy, HMS Triumph, and they move up the west coast of Korea and they sail into the northern Yellow Sea. July 3rd, 1950, a week after the war started, at 0600, the 2 carriers launched strikes against airfields in the Pyongyang area. The North Korean Air Force was present, and the Navy destroyed 38 airplanes on the ground and in the air. The first tactical victories for the F-9F Panther. Multiple strikes over the next 2 days destroy almost everything of military value in the Pyongyang area. Naval aviation has showed up out of nowhere to save the day. Navy airplanes have appeared out of nowhere. The strike is over 400 miles from the nearest air base, thought to be outside of the range of Allied airplanes. This is a rude awakening for the North Koreans and Stalin. Stalin is shocked. He does not want to confront the Americans. He decides not to be involved in the Korean War beyond supplies. He will not send his promised MiG-15s to Korea, although they will fly volunteer missions out of Manchuria to support the MiG Alley. When the Chinese elect to invade North Korea in November of 1950, Stalin says, I will not support you. I don't want anything to do with Korea. So a week after the war has started, there are no land-based bombers in the air. A week after the start of the war in South Korea, there are no U.S. Air Force airplanes providing tactical air support. A week after the start of the war, there are no airfields in Korea capable of operating U.S. Air Force jets. And a week after the start of the war, the strategic capability of the B-36 has not prevented the start of another war. But a week after the invasion, these sea-based tactical jets with tactical proficiency have decisively intervened strategically in the Korean War. And these were flown by a bunch of cadets from Pensacola that were flushing out the ranks of these active squadrons. These were called the Flying Midshipmen. Neil Armstrong was a flying midshipman. They went to college for 2 years, they flew in the Navy for 2 years, then they went back to college for 2 years, and then they were in the reserves for 6 years. The Navy had built this up so they'd have a strong reserve. About 200 of them were scheduled to get out of the Navy on June 30. They were sitting at Treasure Island in San Francisco on June 27th with their orders in hand when Congress and the President said, you can't get out, go back to your units. So here was a flush group of tactically proficient pilots going back to their airplanes. And this is the nature of service to your nation. You never know when you'll be called on to execute the skills that you have developed. And these guys, who were just the normal guys you went to high school with, who had the hot rods in the parking lot, are suddenly in Korea making the world a much different place. Now, due to these budget cuts, the Army's become a hollow force of occupation. So on July 2nd, this ill-trained, poorly equipped combat regiment under Colonel Smith is sent to Korea. It's called Task Force Smith. And this is part of the hubris of the U.S. They kind of look at these Koreans as little yellow men who don't know how to fight. Our Army guys who won World War II can go over there and take care of these guys. Well, they get their butts kicked. 3,000 casualties in 5 days. They start retreating towards the Pusan perimeter. Kim says things are really going good here in South Korea. Stalin, send me those jets you promised. Stalin says, nah, I don't want to mess with the U.S. Because he'd seen what the U.S. was in World War II, and he knew how weak he was and how strong the U.S. was. Because of this amphibious group that landed in Japan for the training exercise, they have an amphibious capability, and on July 18th, the 1st Cavalry lands in the Pusan perimeter and halts the North Korean advance. But they're supported by the F-4Us and the A-1 Sky Raiders, prop-driven airplanes off the Valley Forge, which multiply their fighting strength by giving tactical air support close to the front lines. The U.S. Air Force jets do not have the range or loiter capability to do support. They've not been trained in support, and the Army doesn't want them within a half mile of the front lines. This would not have been possible if MacArthur hadn't called the amphibious force over to Korea. MacArthur asked for help from the Marine Corps, and Commandant Cates stresses every man in the Marine Corps is a combat proficient rifleman. The Marines are made up of combat officers with experience in World War II, and NCOs, the backbone of them fighting. And in 12 days, they put together a combat regiment, and they sail to Korea. They land in August, and they put a stop to the North Korean advance. The Marines have proven their worth. Amphibious operations are a part of our operations. And for the unconvinced on the capability of the Marine Corps, the next few months would show what they could do. A Marine combat regiment with air support is rated as the equivalent of one Army division without air support. There's such a close air team where you have an aviator on the ground with the troops close to the front lines to direct the close air support. And the ultimate weapon, the atomic bomb, will not be used. The B-36 will not fly. And Secretary Johnson is fired after 17 months on the job when Truman finds out he's going behind Truman's back to try to get the 1952 Democratic presidential nomination. He was a real dirtball. The strategic value of the aircraft carrier has been proven. There was no other force available which could have struck so quickly and decisively as the aircraft carriers. All political arguments over the integration of aviation into the Air Force ended. Never again would somebody bring up that the Navy should be joined with the Air Force. The next year, Congress approves the building of the first 4 supercarriers: Forrestal, Saratoga, Ranger, and Independence. The Revolt was pivotal to the future of naval aviation and the Marine Corps. Most historians have cited this as a failure in the Navy, but history has proven it was the right outcome. If Denfield, Burke, and Rafford had not acted when they did, there's a good chance in 1950 there would not have been any aircraft carriers in the Western Pacific. Had the Admirals not revolted, there's no way of telling what might have happened in Korea. In our history that they've released, the official documents from the Chinese and the Russians of that period, when the Marines landed at Incheon and reestablished the 38th parallel, MacArthur said we should go all the way to the Yalu. And they were rolling the North Koreans back so rapidly that it looked like he could be at the Yalu in about 2 months. When the Chinese saw this happening, they started moving all the troops in their country to the North Korean border. And they infiltrated North Korea very, very stealthily, only moving at night, using sticks behind them to cover their tracks in the snow, so that when the 250,000 Chinese troops attacked the U.S. forces, nobody knew they were there. In fact, there's a quip that the Marine Commander Smith of the 1st Marine Division up at Hagaruri and near the Chosin Reservoir said there are thousands of Chinese here. MacArthur's intelligence chief said, no, there are no Chinese in North Korea. Smith didn't use 4-letter words, but he used some words that described that you have no idea what you're talking about. But China's plans to invade Formosa, China's plans to roll down into Indochina, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, after they had fought the U.S. for 2 years and had 900,000 casualties, they elected that they would stay inside the Chinese borders. So Truman, not knowing what he was doing, when he let the troops go to the 38th, north of the 38th parallel, actually changed the course of history in the Pacific. And we have to thank these admirals for what they did. I'd be glad to address any questions or comments.
Randy, any idea what George Marshall's attitude was after the Marines saved Korea and the Navy helping out?
George Marshall became Secretary of State.
Oh, state.
He was Secretary of State after he left the Army. He was the guy with the Marshall Plan. When he fired...
Bradley, I'm talking about.
Okay, well, I'm going back to Marshall.
Right.
When when Johnson was fired, Truman wanted somebody that was highly respected for the Secretary of Defense, so he tapped Marshall. And Marshall said, I was all wrong. The U.S. has to maintain a very capable military in order to deter aggression by potential aggressors. And that set the tone, actually, since the Korean War. The U.S. fought the Cold War. We were ready to go to war at any time. We had some hot spots in Vietnam and other places around. And it kept world order all during that time because nobody would challenge the U.S. might. And I might be stepping on a political hot potato here, but if anybody thinks demobilizing the U.S. military to increase domestic spending will make the world a safer place, they should read some history. The bad guys only respect power. Yeah. Yes.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment.
Yeah.
That's one of the most interesting programs I've ever seen.
Thank you.
Thank you, good job.
And it's not known. People don't know this stuff. And it's, I was reading a book about the Korean War called, I can't remember the name of the book, but I was reading it, and they described how this aircraft carrier showed up off the North Korean coast and destroyed the North Korean Air Force, and Stalin was shocked. Where the hell did those airplanes come from? You told me that nobody could reach that base up there in North Korea. I don't want anything to do with Korea. I'm out of here. And that was the result of that. Okay. Well, thank you.